It was supposed to be a happy day at the Grand Carnival. People of all ages came to have fun. Kids held colorful balloons, parents carried bags full of cotton candy, and music filled the air. Everywhere you looked, there were flashing lights and happy faces. The Ferris wheel stood tall in the middle of the carnival, spinning slowly, with people laughing as they reached the top. The smell of buttery popcorn and sweet caramel apples made everyone hungry. People walked from one game to another, trying to win stuffed animals and other prizes. In the middle of all this fun, a clown named Charlie walked onto the scene. He wore big red shoes that made squeaky sounds every time he took a step. His clothes were bright and silly striped pants, a big yellow shirt, and a red nose that honked when he pressed it. He juggled rubber chickens and made funny faces, making kids giggle and parents smile. To most people, Charlie looked like a regular clown. He tripped over his big shoes on purpose and fell, making the crowd laugh. He pulled out long scarves from his pocket that never seemed to end, and he even made balloon animals for the little kids. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something different about him. Charlie moved with great care. Every step he took, every trick he did, was perfect. His eyes, hidden behind the white and red face paint, were sharp and focused. It was almost like he was watching everything around him very closely. Charlie wasn't just any clown. He had a secret. As he performed his tricks, his eyes scanned the carnival. He watched the people, the workers, and even the security guards. He seemed to notice things that others didn't. But nobody paid attention to that. To them, he was just a funny man with a painted smile and silly clothes. Children ran up to him, asking for balloons. Charlie bent down, twisted the long balloons, and handed them over with a big grin. "Here you go. A balloon dog just for you," he said in his cheerful clown voice. The kids clapped their hands and ran back to their parents, holding their new balloon pets. As Charlie moved through the carnival, he performed little tricks along the way. He pulled a coin from behind a man's ear and made a handkerchief disappear in his hands. People laughed and clapped, enjoying his silly acts. But there was something different about the way Charlie moved. He didn't seem clumsy at all, even though he pretended to be. He never bumped into anyone, and he never missed a step. It was like he knew exactly where everything was, even without looking. A man selling ice cream watched Charlie and shook his head. "That clown sure knows what he's doing," he said to his friend. "But there's something strange about him. I can't quite figure it out." Meanwhile, a security guard named Rick stood nearby, watching Charlie too. Rick didn't like clowns. He thought they were silly and useless. He folded his arms and frowned as he watched Charlie juggle colorful balls. "Just another clown trying to get attention," he muttered under his breath. Charlie kept performing, but he noticed Rick watching him. He gave the guard a little wave and smiled, but Rick only frowned harder. Charlie chuckled softly to himself and continued his act. At one point, Charlie walked over to a small group of kids and did a little magic trick with a deck of cards. He shuffled the cards quickly, and when he pulled one out, it was the exact card a little boy had picked. The boy's eyes widened with surprise, and Charlie laughed. "Magic," he said with a wink. As the crowd cheered, Charlie's eyes flickered toward the Ferris wheel again. He watched the workers there, paying close attention to how they operated the ride. He saw one of them taking a long break and another looking distracted. Charlie took a mental note but kept his cheerful act going. No one knew why he was really there. They only saw the silly clown who made them laugh. But behind that painted face, Charlie was thinking, planning, and observing. He wasn't just here for fun. After a while, Charlie walked to a quieter part of the carnival. He sat on a bench, took off his hat, and wiped some sweat from his forehead. He watched as people walked past, laughing and talking. A little girl sat down next to him and stared. "Are you a real clown?" she asked curiously. Charlie smiled and nodded. "Of course I am," he said, honking his red nose. "What do you think?" The girl giggled. "You don't seem like a real clown," she said. "You don't fall down like the other clowns do." Charlie grinned. "Well, maybe I'm a special kind of clown," he said. "One who doesn't like falling down." The girl laughed and ran off to find her parents. Charlie watched her go, then looked around again. He saw Rick still standing near the popcorn stand, still watching him. Charlie gave him a little wink and tipped his hat before walking away. Rick narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust this clown. Something about him didn't feel right. Charlie made his way back to the busy part of the carnival, doing little tricks here and there. He made sure to act silly enough to keep people laughing, but in his mind, he was focused on something else. As the sun started to set, the carnival lights grew brighter, and the crowd grew bigger. Charlie stood in front of the mirror maze, looking at his own reflection. He wiped his face lightly, smudging the paint just a little. For a brief moment, a serious expression crossed his face, one that was completely different from the goofy clown everyone saw. He took a deep breath and fixed his painted smile again. No one could know who he really was. Not yet. Charlie walked back into the crowd, ready to put on his best act yet. People laughed and clapped as he performed more tricks, but deep down, he knew he wasn't here just to make people smile. Because underneath the red nose and silly clothes, Charlie had a much bigger reason for being at the Grand Carnival. And soon, everyone would find out. In one busy corner of the carnival, Officer Rick stood with his arms crossed. He was tall, strong, and always serious. Everyone at the carnival knew him. He never smiled, and he never joked. He was always looking for trouble. Rick didn't like the carnival. Too many people. Too much noise. And, worst of all, too many clowns. He thought clowns were nothing but trouble. They distracted people. They caused silly problems. And Rick didn't like silly things. Rick's sharp eyes moved around the crowd. Kids ran past him, laughing and eating sticky cotton candy. Parents followed behind, trying to keep up. Carnival workers shouted, inviting people to try games and win prizes. The smell of popcorn and fried food filled the air. But Rick wasn't paying attention to any of that. His eyes were locked on one person, Charlie, the clown. Charlie was juggling colorful balls in the middle of a group of children. He had a big red nose, a wide painted smile, and shoes that were way too big for his feet. Every time he moved, his shoes made a funny squeaky sound. The kids laughed, and even some adults chuckled. Rick, however, was not laughing. "Clowns," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Always causing trouble." Just then, Charlie threw a bright blue water balloon into the air. It flipped once, twice, then suddenly, it burst. The water splashed right onto Rick's uniform. The crowd gasped. For a second, everything was quiet. Rick's face turned red with anger. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward. "Watch it, bozo," he growled. Some teenagers in the crowd started laughing. A little boy pointed and said, "Look." The policeman got wet. More laughter followed. Rick's face turned even redder. Charlie, however, didn't seem worried. Instead, he gave a big, silly bow. He held out his arms wide and tipped his hat in an exaggerated way. Rick didn't like that. Not one bit. His jaw tightened, and he took another step closer. "Don't think I won't take you in," Rick said in a low, angry voice. "One wrong move, clown." Charlie stood up straight and looked at Rick. His face was still painted with a big smile, but his eyes were different. They were sharp, focused. Almost like he wasn't afraid at all. Rick stared at him for a long moment. He expected Charlie to apologize, to get scared, or to run away. But Charlie didn't do any of those things. He just stood there, smiling, as if he was waiting for something. The crowd watched closely. Some people whispered to each other. A few kids looked nervous. No one wanted to see what would happen next. Finally, Rick shook his head and turned away. "Clowns," he muttered again. "Nothing but trouble." He stomped off, wiping his wet uniform with a handkerchief. Charlie watched him go. The painted smile on his face never changed, but something in his eyes sparkled a secret, silent message that only he knew. As soon as Rick was gone, Charlie went back to his tricks. He pulled out a balloon and started twisting it into a dog shape. The kids clapped and cheered. But deep down, Charlie knew one thing: Rick wasn't going to leave him alone. Not today. Rick walked back to his usual spot near the popcorn stand. His uniform was still damp from the water balloon. He frowned and crossed his arms again. His eyes stayed on Charlie. "That clown is up to something," he muttered under his breath. "I know it." He watched Charlie carefully. The clown was back to doing silly tricks, pretending to trip over his own shoes, making funny faces, and juggling rubber chickens. But something about him didn't feel right. Rick had been a police officer for a long time. He had a feeling when something was wrong, and right now, that feeling was strong. Charlie was too good at what he did. He never really fell. He never made mistakes. And his eyes, those eyes didn't look like the eyes of a normal clown. They were too sharp. Too smart. Rick decided to follow Charlie, just to be sure. He moved slowly through the crowd, keeping his eyes on the clown's every move. Charlie was busy making balloon animals for the kids. He smiled and laughed, but every now and then, Rick noticed something. Charlie's eyes would flicker around the carnival. He was watching everything. He saw the ticket booths, the game stalls, and even the security cameras. "What are you up to, clown?" Rick thought to himself. Charlie knew he was being watched. He could feel Rick's eyes on him, but he didn't let it show. He kept playing his part, making kids laugh and doing tricks. But in his mind, Charlie was planning something else. He wasn't just a clown. And he wasn't at the carnival just for fun. As he tied a balloon into the shape of a giraffe, he thought about his real purpose. He had a job to do. And it was almost time. Charlie glanced over at Rick, who was still standing near the popcorn stand, staring at him. Charlie smiled wider and gave the balloon giraffe to a little girl. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another water balloon. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the air again. This time, it didn't hit Rick. It landed harmlessly on the ground and burst with a soft pop. Rick tensed up but didn't move. He just watched. Charlie winked at him. Rick's hands curled into fists. He didn't like games. And he especially didn't like clowns who played them. As the day went on, the tension between Rick and Charlie grew stronger. Every time Rick thought Charlie was just being a silly clown, Charlie would do something small, something strange that made Rick wonder. A quick glance at the Ferris wheel. A whispered word to a carnival worker. A sudden pause in his juggling act. Rick didn't like it. He didn't like it one bit. By evening, Rick had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Charlie out of his sight. And Charlie? He knew the real game was just about to begin. As the sun moved across the sky, the Grand Carnival grew even busier. More people arrived, filling the walkways with laughter and excitement. The smell of popcorn, cotton candy, and fried food mixed in the air. Children ran from ride to ride, parents followed, and carnival workers shouted to get people to play their games. But Officer Rick wasn't enjoying any of it. His eyes were locked on one person, Charlie the clown. Rick didn't trust Charlie. He had been watching him all day, and something just didn't feel right. Every time there was a small problem, a spilled drink, a lost child, or even a loud noise, Charlie was always nearby. Rick followed him through the crowd, pretending to be just another carnival visitor. But inside, he was paying close attention. Charlie would slip on a banana peel and make everyone laugh. But just when people were distracted, a prize from a game booth would go missing. A popcorn cart would be knocked over. A man in a suit would look around, confused, checking his empty pockets. Rick's frown grew deeper. Something is going on, he muttered to himself. Charlie, however, acted like he didn't have a care in the world. When Rick confronted him, Charlie only gave a big goofy smile and shrugged. "Oops," he would say in his cheerful clown voice. "Clumsy me." But Rick didn't believe it. No one could be that clumsy. Not all the time. Rick kept watching. As the hours passed, he noticed something strange. Whenever Charlie finished a show or a magic trick, he would slip away. He would disappear behind the booths and tents, away from the crowd. Rick followed carefully. Behind the scenes, Charlie was very different. His smile was gone. His steps were quick and quiet. He pulled out a small phone from his big clown pants and spoke in a low voice. Rick couldn't hear what he was saying, but he knew it wasn't about balloons and magic tricks. Charlie also had a small notebook hidden in his pocket. Every now and then, he would pull it out and write something down quickly before tucking it back away. Rick narrowed his eyes. What is he writing? He wondered. It didn't take long for carnival workers to start whispering. They had seen Charlie's strange behavior too. Did you see Charlie? One worker asked another. He's always sneaking around. Yeah, said the other worker. I heard he's not really a clown. Maybe he's a spy. Rick overheard their conversation and felt even more sure of his suspicions. He wasn't the only one who thought something was off. Later in the day, Rick spotted Charlie talking to the carnival manager. The manager was a serious-looking man in a dark suit, very different from the colorful carnival workers. Charlie handed the manager a stack of papers. The manager looked at them, nodded, and walked away without a word. Rick frowned. What kind of clown gives papers to the boss? Shouldn't he be juggling or making balloon animals? Rick decided to get closer. He walked up to Charlie just as he finished his conversation. Charlie saw Rick coming and gave him a big, silly grin. Hello there, Officer Rick, he said in a happy voice. Having fun at the carnival? Rick crossed his arms. What were you talking about with the manager? He asked. Charlie's smile didn't fade. Oh, just important clown business, he said with a wink. Rick didn't smile. I don't believe you, he said. You're up to something, and I'm going to find out what it is. Charlie chuckled and tipped his hat. Well, good luck with that, officer, he said before walking away, juggling 3 apples as if nothing had happened. Rick followed him again. He watched as Charlie continued his act, making kids laugh and doing silly tricks. But Rick wasn't fooled. He saw how Charlie's eyes kept scanning the crowd. Something was definitely going on. By evening, Rick's patience was wearing thin. The carnival lights glowed brightly, and the music was louder than ever. People lined up for rides, and the Ferris wheel spun against the night sky. But Rick only had eyes for Charlie. He followed him to the game booths, watching as he handed a child a stuffed bear. He watched him at the food stands, where he bought a giant candy apple and took small